Hey everybody, and welcome to this, my third of 3 videos on the Minolta Alpha, also called the Maxxum or the Dynax 7. In the first video, we looked at what everything on the camera was. In the second video, we talked about how to use the camera to take photos. This video is going to focus solely on the configurations and options menus. All right, so first thing I'm going to show you right here is that when I turn the Alpha 7 on, I get an error message. This happens with this camera because the electronics are starting to fail. This is my 4th model of this camera. So far, the only one I've had that actually works reliably is this one that's missing the exposure compensation dial and has now a broken film back. These are really good and capable cameras, but problematic. So first thing let's do is figure out how to fix this error. Let's turn it off, see what happens if we turn it back on. Oh, it's working this time. All right, it's working that time. So we flipped it off and on. If flipping it off and on does not work and you still get the error, what you need to do is take the lens off, turn it back on, and then mount the lens with the camera turned on. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we access the menus through the rear cover. Where's the rear cover? It's right here. There we go. So we're going to flip this open and now we can get to the rear cover. And one thing you can tell is that because this is a Japanese model, that is in Japanese right there. On the Maxxum or the Dynax, the Japanese characters are in English and they indicate that that's the enter button. So whenever we have to push the enter button, we'll be pushing the button that corresponds to the Japanese characters that I assume mean enter. So what we're going to do now is we're going to select Custom, which is this button over here on the far right. So on the front dial, right here, we use this to scroll through the custom functions. The rear dial, and you can also use left and right on the rear command pad to scroll through the functions. The rear dial makes your choices, and so do up and down on the rear command pad. So 2 options on how you want to adjust your settings, totally a matter of personal preference which one you want to use. And you can see here there are 2 markers, 1 and 2. 1 is what's called reversed out, and 2 is standard. So standard is like you would see in a book, black text on a white background. Reversed out is white text on a black background. The reversed out option is the one that's selected. So right now on custom function 1, option 1 is selected. So custom function 1, and there are how many total custom functions? Holy cow. There are 35 custom functions on this camera. So we're going to go through all of them and talk about what they are. Custom function 1, autofocus release priority. Option 1 is focus priority, means the camera will only fire once you have focus confirmation. Option 2 is release priority, meaning the camera will fire even if you don't have focus. Matter of personal preference. In general, if you want to save film, stick with option 1. Custom function 2, film rewind start, automatic or manual. Automatic means when you've reached the end of the roll, or the cassette, when you've hit frame 24 or 36, boom, instantly, film rewind. Manual means that the camera will stop taking photos and you have to tell it to manually rewind the film. Matter of personal preference, I want it to automatically rewind. It saves a little bit of time and it's just a little bit easier to do. Custom function 3, film tip. Option 1 is the film is rewound into the cassette, and option 2 is a leader is left out. Now, if you'll remember when we talked about rewinding the film, this is what's meant by a leader. I think that the camera actually leads a tip about like this when it rewinds using that setting. And then option 1 means that it rewinds it completely into the cassette. So matter of personal preference, but this has a use as well. If you are halfway through a roll and you know that you're not going to be using the rest of it, come in here to this custom function, select option 2, and leave yourself a little bit of a film tip. And then when you take your film out, pull out a little bit of the leader, and just write down Maxxum 7 or whichever camera, date, start at frame, whatever frame you were on, +1. And that way, when you grab this, you know which camera it was in and which frame to start and on the next one. If you put it in a different camera, then that's fine. You just know what to advance to. And that's important to communicate with your future self when you're taking notes so that your future self doesn't overwrite whatever photos were on the roll that you had just partially used. Custom function 4, DX memory, off and on. With memory off, the film speed is always set to the DX code. Now this is the DX code on the film right here, this black and silver bar. With on, what happens is that if you push and pull the film, it will remember that from roll to roll. So let's say you have a dozen rolls of a 400 ISO film, a black and white 400 ISO film, and you're going to push it to 1600, you're pushing all of it. What you do is come in here and you set DX code memory to on. That way, you don't have to change the ISO for every single roll. You just have to change it once and it will remember. At the end of your shoot, just change it to off. Custom function 5, film release lock. All right, so off and on, with lock off, the shutter can be fired without film in the camera. With lock on, the shutter will not fire unless there is film in the camera. Matter of personal preference and whether or not you want to be able to test the camera or not without film. Custom function 6, focus hold button. This applies only to lenses with a focus hold button feature. So option 1 is focus hold. When you press the focus hold button on the lens, it locks focus. Option 2 is continuous bracketing. When the focus hold button is pressed, it initiates bracketing based on the preset function in custom function 11, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. And then option 3 is the focus hold button gives you depth of field preview. If you don't have any lenses with the focus hold button, this custom function does nothing whatsoever for you. If you do have lenses with the focus hold button, then it's a matter of personal preference what you want that button to do. Custom function 7 is eyepiece sensor activation. And your options here are on, well, they're, how's it worded? On grip and by main switch. Okay. So the main switch and grip sensor is option 1. And what that means is that the eyepiece sensor turns on when the grip is tripped. Now, if you remember, the front of the camera has these little contacts. And when you hold them, this is the grip sensor. So with option 1, this plus the eyepiece, you have to be holding the camera like this for the eyepiece sensor to turn on. With option 2, it's with the main power switch. So option 2 means that eyepiece activation will always turn on whether or not you're holding the grip. The downside to option 2 is that eyepiece activation is not sensitive enough to know if it's your eye or your belly. So if you have option 2 set, this will turn on anytime the camera is up against your back or your side or your belly, whatever it is, if you're using it with a camera strap. So I would recommend option 1, because generally speaking, when we're holding the camera up to our eyes, we're going to also be triggering the contacts on the front of it. With option 2, with this one, you will drain the batteries significantly faster. Custom function 8 is your frame counter. With option 1, the data panel frame counter counts up, and with option 2, it counts down. Matter of personal preference, how you want to have your data displayed. Custom function 9 is your autofocus manual focus control button on the back rear dial. That's this button right here in the center. With option 1, you press it to activate it and release it to cancel. That's your autofocus manual focus toggle. With option 2, you press once to activate it, press again to cancel. Matter of personal preference whether you want this to be a toggle switch or a press button. I think I misspoke. Custom function 9 applies to this button up here, not the one in the center here. It's your AF/MF button, not the AF button. Okay. Custom function 10 applies to the AEL button right here. And this is the same as function 9, whether it's press to hold or toggle. So option 1 is press and hold, option 2 is toggle. Matter of personal preference. Custom function 11, this is our bracketing exposure sequence. And again, matter of personal preference here. When you look at your roll of films, you want to see it proper under over or under proper over. Just however you want to get your information. Custom function 12 is film rewind speed. Option 1 is fast, which is 7 seconds for a 36 frame roll. Option 2 is silent, which is 15.5 seconds for 36 frames. Just a matter of personal preference how loud you want your rewind to be. If you are going to something like your kids' play or a golf tournament and you want to use this camera, then you do want to set it to option 2. Honestly, if you want to leave it in option 2 all the time, that's fine. The difference between 7 and 15 seconds of rewind speed isn't huge. Custom function 13, metering display time. These are in seconds, 5, 10, or 15. How long do you want the meter to display inside the viewfinder or on the LCD, wherever it displays, after you have to press the shutter button? Personal preference on this one. Custom function 14 is autofocus area display. Option 1 is the LEDs are active for 0.3 seconds after focus lock. Option 2 is 0.6 seconds. And option 3 is the autofocus only displays if you press the focus area selector or autofocus button. Matter of personal preference here. I kind of like having it be automatic, confirming where the autofocus is. Custom function 15 is your front and rear control dial lock. 1 is off, 2, so you have 3 options. 1 is off, which means your front and rear dials function. This is your lock. Your lock feature is off. It's a bit weirdly worded. Option 2 is dials do not function when the camera is not metering and the grip sensor is not activated. So option 2 is what you would use if you find you're carrying this and you accidentally keep bumping into your dials and changing settings. Basically, in order for your dials to work with option 2, the grip sensor has to be active, your camera has to be actively metering, and then you can adjust your settings. And then option 3 is the dials are not functional only when not metering. So basically, option 3 is the same as option 2, less the grip sensor requirement. Right. Custom function 16, release lock with the lens. So basically, this is off or on, and what this means is with option 1, the shutter cannot fire if a lens is not attached, and with option 2, the shutter can fire if a lens is not attached. Basically, option 2 is good if you're using things like, come on, nope, wrong button, there we go. So option 2 is useful if you have something like this Canon FD to Minolta Alpha adapter, which does not have a chip on it. And that, if I were to have option 1 selected and put this on my camera, the camera would not fire because there's no chips. It doesn't know that the lens is connected. So largely a matter of personal preference. If you're only using native mount lenses for your Minolta Alpha 7, it doesn't matter which one of these you choose for camera function, and it's just a matter of whether or not you want the camera to fire without a lens. Custom function 17 is your autofocus drive speed, fast and slow. Fast is the maximum of the film, maximizes your film advance speed. So basically, with the fast autofocus speed, your autofocus will track more quickly and it allows you to shoot more frames in sequence. That's really good if you're tracking sports, let's say. You're sitting along the third baseline, you have a runner coming in to slide into third base, and you want to get every shot possible. This would be a good one. Option 2 is slow, and that's good for macro work, and photography in reduced illumination. So if you're doing macros with an autofocus macro lens, or if you have an autofocus macro tube with a lens on it, that's a good option because there's less light with macro work, just because of the rule of inverse squares outside the scope of this video. Or if you're at your kid's play or an evening soccer game or something like that, slow will give you fewer shots, but will give you more accurate autofocus. Custom function 18 is exposure compensation with rear dial in program, aperture priority, and shutter priority modes. So, there are 3 options here, and there are tables for these, which I will, but basically this only applies to P, A, and S mode, does not apply to manual. And it has to do with how your front and rear command dials operate in those modes. It's just a matter of personal preference which way you want to have them work. Custom function 19 is your control dial exchanged control. Now what this means is that, so with option 1, your front dial controls the shutter speed in modes which you can control the shutter speed. In option 2, your rear dial controls the aperture in modes where you can control it. I'm sorry, in option 2, the front controls the aperture. So basically, do you want shutter aperture or aperture shutter? Matter of personal preference, which way you're used to using your command dials. Custom function 20 is your flash metering. There are 3 options: ADI, TTL, 4-segment, and TTL average. So ADI stands for Advanced Distance Integration, which can be used with lenses and flashes designated with a letter D on Minolta and Konica Minolta lenses. To the best of my knowledge, all Sony lenses have this integration. So ADI is going to give you better results when your flash is pointed directly at a shiny or reflective subject, which can lead in that specific situation to TTL flash metering, reading light from the reflective and bright points and throwing off your overall flash exposure. So that's the situation where ADI is specifically advantageous. In other situations, ADI is just fine. It's a matter of personal preference and expectation whether you want to use ADI or TTL. However, I have it set to TTL because I have no Minolta D lenses and no Minolta flashes that can do anything with ADI. So if you have none of those D lenses and none of those flashes, just leave it on 2. That will set the camera up to know that it's going to be doing TTL metering. Then the difference comes down to 4-segment or averaging. So 4-segment is that it uses 4-segment metering for flash metering. Basically, it takes 4 different areas of the scene, meters the flash, the light coming out of the back from the subject when the flash is taken and before the flash is used to calculate the proper exposure. With averaging, instead of using those 4 segments, it takes the whole scene and averages all that information together. Matter of personal preference and shooting style and what you find works better or worse for you when you're using a flash with this camera. Custom function 21 is the autofocus illuminator. With this, the light used for autofocus, which is, by the way, on the front of the camera, right here is what we're talking about, this light. With option 1, the light is used in low light situations. With option 2, the camera never uses the autofocus assist light. Now with option 2, that applies to both the camera's light as well as autofocus assist illuminators on the flash units. So some of the flashes have little LEDs that can work as AF illumination assistants. Matter of situation, realistically. If you're in a dark setting, a museum, an outdoor performance in the evening, something like that, and you don't want the AF light to interfere with other photos or distract the performers or something like that, just turn it off. Otherwise, on however you want to shoot. Custom function 22 is your focus mode autofocus AFA tasking. So autofocus automatic mode tasking. Option 1 is automatic autofocus mode selection, and option 2 is direct manual focus. Now what option 2 means is that after focus is confirmed, you can manually adjust the focus ring. So with direct manual focus, what you want to do is read the manual for use on that function, as there are some lens limitations and the process can be a bit unwieldy if you're new to it. So if that's something you're interested in doing more of, then check out the manual. The part 1 of the option 1 is your standard baseline use of autofocus. It's what we're all used to for anyone who has shot an autofocus camera. Custom function 23, autofocus using the shutter release button. Option 1 is that autofocus activates when the shutter is half pressed. That's our standard normal integration for autofocus. And option 2 is your autofocus will not work with the shutter button, only the AF button. So it's just a matter of shooting style and personal preference. Do you want autofocus to work half with the shutter button or only with the AF button? Custom function 24 is full automatic mode on the exposure mode dial. So that is this green P right here, what we're talking about in this part of the video. In program, camera function changes are prevented. So basically, the option 1 prevents program shifting. Option 2, in program mode, function changes are possible. With option 2, full automatic will not display on the LCD. Auto flash will not be available. The flash will always fire if popped up or if there's a flash on the camera. And when the camera is turned off, any changes you make manually will be canceled. So and also with option 2, custom functions 1, 20, 21, 22, and 23 are used with this function. So you can go back and cross-reference those functions and just understand that they work with this one. Matter of personal preference. Honestly, I don't shoot in full auto at all. So for me, this isn't going to matter. And if you don't shoot in full auto mode, this isn't going to matter at all. But if you do, then there are some differences within this that are worth understanding. Custom function 25, tasking on exposure mode dial for position 3. Okay, what we're talking about here is position 3 on this dial on top. So option 1 is memory mod, which means position 3 allows you to use a third memory slot. Basically, when you're talking about option 3 here works exactly the same as options 1 and 2, which allow you to set up different memory function memories on your camera. So option 2 activates smooth transfocus simulation mode. Now, that's a big deal with this camera, or a lot of people make a big deal about it with this camera. In the 2000s, I did a round glass review. It was one of my first lens reviews on the Sony 135 STF smooth transfocus lens. In the early 2000s, Minolta designed and released that lens. And it's a lens that's designed to make the out of focus area very appealing by creating shadows around the edges of each of the out of focus circles or points, the infinite number of them that reach the film in this camera's case, so that the out of focus area blends more smoothly. And it is a much different effect than many cameras have. So with this camera, and to the best of my knowledge, it's the only camera in the world that has this feature, you can simulate that look. And what option 2 does is when you switch to memory position 3, the camera will take a series of 7 exposures at different closely related apertures. And that has the effect of blurring the boundary of each out of focus point. So basically, if you have a tripod and a stationary subject, you can simulate the STF look with this camera. And I happen to enjoy doing that when I get the chance, so that's why that is set to on. Custom function 26 is flash burst with exposure compensation. This applies only for exposure compensation, not for flash power exposure compensation. So exposure compensation here, not here. With option 1, you get a varied burst. When the flash fires with exposure compensation set on the camera, the flash burst, shutter speed, and aperture can all be changed by the camera to achieve proper exposure compensation. So basically, if you adjust this dial on top to plus or minus some number, the camera can use shutter speed, aperture, and flash power to achieve that compensation. With option 2, it's a fixed burst only, which means the power of the flash will be fixed, but the camera can adjust the shutter speed and aperture to achieve exposure compensation. So matter of personal preference, which one you want and how you want the camera to control exposure compensation with a flash. Custom function 27 is detailed display. Showing all your settings is option 1, and it's obvious. Basically, it means it's going to show all your settings. Option 2 is it shows only the changes to the standard settings and only displays what you have changed from the standard parameters. So if I pull up the other Maxxum here, you can see here there are a bunch of different informational displays. And this is the standard display. This is telling me what functions I have set. There we go. You can see it changes with different modes. If I selected option 2, it would only show me what functions are different from the standard parameters. So if I know what all my parameters are, then it will only show me what's different. That way I can know at a glance whether or not something is set correctly or incorrectly. All right, custom function 28. Custom function 28 is your operation display. Basically, this applies to dials or functions that are selected but not already on the display, and it confirms setting changes visually on or off. And this is just a matter of personal preference. Do you want the camera to confirm what changes are being made or not? I like to know. I like the confirmation that I've successfully made the change, so I do like to set it to on. Custom function 29 is your large icon display. This is solely a function of how good are your eyes, old, young, weak, strong. Basically, with on, the icons and the information on the LCD on the back here will be larger. Custom function 30 is meter index display on or off, and that is whether or not the meter and your bracketing position and number and order are displayed on this LCD screen when you're in your shooting mode. On or off, matter of personal preference. I like to have that just as a confirmation or as an additional place to find the data. Custom function 31 is exposure history display. Pressing the display button shows you the exposure data for the last 5 frames in memory. And this is on or off. Do you want to be able to look at that information or no? Matter of personal preference. Custom function 32, vertical display, on or off. Another personal preference setting, whether or not you want the display to change orientation, landscape, or portrait with how you hold the camera. Custom function 33 is imprint intensity. This has to do with how intense the date imprint is in the camera. This only applies when you're using the date imprint function. So off, and then 1 through 7. 1 is the dimmest, 7 is the brightest. By and large, this is trial and error with your film, but let's say you're shooting a 400 ISO film pushed to 1600 or an 800 ISO film, something like that. You'd probably want to set it at 1 or 2. Faster films will benefit from a dimmer imprint because you'll get a crisper imprint without glow around them. What if you're shooting something like an ADOX 20 or RPX 25 or Ilford Pan F50 or even a Kodak Vision stock with its very thick remjet backing that you've cut for use in a still camera. Then you'd want to be up around 6 or 7, and a little bit of trial and error to see how they work. But slower films will generally benefit from a brighter imprint because they need more light just as a baseline. Custom function 34 is your ID number. This allows you to record ID numbers, and I forget if it imprints it on the film or if it only saves it to the camera's memory, for up to 9 different cameras. So if you have up to 9 of these Minoltas, recording that information will allow you to see if one of them is consistently functioning incorrectly. Custom function 35 is your language, which are selection. You can choose between Japanese, English, German, French, and Spanish. And that is all 35 of the custom functions in this camera. It's an incredibly customizable camera for whatever you need it to do, so that you can set it up to be really very personalized to you and your shooting style. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.